Welcome back, everyone. This week we're going to be talking about the idea of recession-proof stocks, insofar as proof means not proof. A few weeks back, I noted how people were misrepresenting Trulieve as a monopoly. One of the comments I examined was the following statement. Quote, "In its pursuit of a larger customer base and greater profits, Trulieve has invited millions of Floridians to join it in reckless violation of federal criminal law." End quote. I proceeded to note that since 2016, Trulieve has lost $685 million. I went on to examine the reckless and irresponsible phrase of greater profits. Greater is a modifying adjective of the word profit, which presupposes that there are profits. Greater is a comparative word too. The presence of profits in the first place is necessary to establish a baseline for something to be greater than. As I keep noting though, these tactics aren't a red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat dynamic, but broadly a human tendency. For instance, take the phrase, "you're looking thinner." The number of times I've heard this said to a fat person who is less fat but still fat is remarkable. Er, is a suffix that modifies the adjective thin, which creates the word thinner. This suggests that the individual is being compared to a prior level of thinness, which they weren't. The comparative word thinner inherently requires a baseline of thinness. Similarly, greater requires an initial amount of profits to begin with. Nonetheless, people find it necessary to lie to others in a way that's predicated on faulty presuppositions. Interestingly enough, go ahead and ask the complimenter in this scenario why they find it appropriate to lie and misrepresent reality. You'll quickly come to realize how little people care about truth or honesty. End quote. Now, I'm sure that most people dismissed what I pointed out and rolled their eyes as though I'm being pedantic. But as I noted, that's because most people care very little about truth and honesty. The gist of today's article is that the vast majority of people are liars, and that the vast majority of people don't care about that fact. Matter of fact, they're readily on standby to victim shame anybody who falls for the lies due to not doing their own due diligence. Yes, it's perverted and obscene, but that's how it goes. In all reality, it's more complicated than that. For instance, people aren't quite chronic liars, but more users of rhetorical smokescreens, ostensible arguments, and are selective information providers who use clever turn of phrases that allow them to technically not lie. The goal isn't to tell the whole truth and be honest, but to technically not lie. Most people have a moral ambiguity and indifference towards the truth. Simply put, most people are subversionary propagandists. Yes, everyday people, your friends, co-workers, family, children, spouse, and a good enough probability that you're also one of them. And that's before we enter the realm of politicians, smart sociopaths, and highly funded research and development campaigns to coerce you into buying their products. This all manifests in how careless people are with their speech, and thus the symptoms emerge. People say things like greater profits, you look thinner, recession-proof stocks. Such and such stock performs well or better. If you've ever wondered why bad people think that they're good people and why other people think bad people are good people, then today's article is going to help reveal why that is. As a little bonus. This article was prompted by me reading a comment on a Florida insurance stock. Quote, "Thank you for this article. How do insurance companies in general and HCI perform in recessions? Do insurance companies have low beta in market turbulence?" End quote. In which the author replied, "Thank you and great questions. Insurance companies generally do well, better, during recessions. Yes, they have a lower beta because their business isn't directly, generally speaking, a whole other research paper needed here, tied to the economy's ups and downs, so their stock prices don't swing as much as other sectors." What a terribly misguided and unhelpful answer, both because it's way too vague, but also because much of it isn't true, as we'll get into. Quote, well, end quote, is an absolute statement towards some expectations, which weren't disclosed, and quote, better is a relative statement towards some expectation or benchmark, which wasn't disclosed. I presume that the S&P is the implicit benchmark, but I don't know. And where's all the necessary qualifiers? Well, better? Doesn't he mean badly or less worse? Can you imagine if I was your portfolio manager and you asked me how we did and I said, well, and then you find out that I lost 5, 15, 25, or 56% of your investment? Would you consider that doing well? But after all, when I was down 56%, then maybe the benchmark was down 60%. And then I could say we're doing well or better. Interesting, isn't that? Let's not forget that people care about a business insofar as its correlation to stock price performance. The stock price is what people ultimately care about. Even if a business doesn't see declines in revenues or margins, or not much at all, it most likely will still see a decline in the stock price. If for any other reason, it'll be due to multiple compression, i.e. going from a 10 times PE to 6 times PE, even though the earnings stayed the same. So, is the person asking about how the stock does or how the company does? I noted this sort of dynamic in my article on Kodiak Gas Services. I showed a chart like this one, and then it says, steady business in any commodity price environment. And here they are showing their operations adjusted gross margin, which if you go read this article, I might have elaborated more on that. It's like, why is adjusted gross margin what we're measuring to determine a steady business? Well, the answer is because it's a flattering figure. But that's a whole nother article on language that we won't get into here. Anyway, steady business in any commodity price environment, they say. I noted that although the natural gas compression companies' revenues and gross profits remained steady during the downturn of the natural gas oil bear market, which started in 2014-15, their stock prices still declined by roughly 70%. The point being is that just because the business is steady doesn't mean that your returns as a shareholder won't be absolutely gut-wrenching. So, back to this comment of insurance companies generally do well, better during recessions. We'll examine the last 3 recessions determined by NBER. He didn't specifically say P&C insurance companies, which is what HCI predominantly is, but we could give him the benefit of the doubt, and that's what he was implicitly talking about when he said insurance companies. Although he did generalize matters by saying insurance companies, which I'll note again how that's interesting. I'll use the KBWP, which is the Property and Casualty Insurance ETF, the KIE, which is the S&P Insurance ETF, and the IAK, the iShares US Insurance ETF, and HCI, the stock that the article was about, which his comment was part of the comment section of, as placeholders for quote-unquote insurance companies. The farther back you go in time, the less of these ETFs were around. As such, I'll use their top 10 holdings in their place when that becomes the case. The KIE looks to be more medical insurance, while IAK appears to be more or less not P&C focused. So here's a chart of the COVID recession. And then pause the video or go back in time. Here's the Great Recession. Well, let's just quickly go over this. COVID recession. You have the SPY in the blue that's down negative 9%. Then the HCI is negative 5%. KIE is down 25%. Now, it depends on where you want to measure, but ultimately, they kind of maintain this pattern on the decline and then on the bounce during the COVID recession. This is what NCIB, is that who they were? NBER. Wrong acronym. NBER, each one of these images is the recession period that NBER determined was the recession. So that means that the stocks fell during the recession and the stocks rebounded during the recession. Not terribly uncommon. So at the end of the recession, which you could say they do well better during a recession. So Okay, the SPY pretty much did better or less worse than the KIE, the KBWP, and the IAK, and only HCI did better or less worse. Then you have the Great Recession, where the SPY did better than KIE or less worse, then KIE or IAK, and HCI did less worse or better. And then you have the dot-com era. HCI wasn't around, let alone any of these ETFs. As such, I'll attempt to show the top 10 constituents of KIE and IAK instead. Of course, the underlying holdings could have changed since then, but this is the best you're going to get out of me. So let's get into it anyway. Then you have the SPY, roughly in the middle of the pack. You could say between outperformers or less underperformers and underperformers. But the margins interest, for instance, Allstate was down 15%, while ACGL was up 47%. And then SPY versus KIE constituents. This is during the dot-com bubble. SPY was down 7%, MET was down 10%, BHF down 24%, and then R&R was up 37%, LNC was up 11%. Up, not down less, but actually up. Okay, so 2 out of the last 3 recessions, he was wrong. Now wait, didn't HCI do better? Yes, it did. But he didn't say, but he said generally. And insofar as KIE or IAK are a general representation of the insurance industry, he was wrong more than right. They don't generally do better. Framed differently, it's a net negative recessionary trade. The outperformance you would have had during the dot-com era, which as an aggregate, those stocks did better than or less worse than the S&P, because that's what happened in the dot-com era. The money that you would have made during the dot-com era, putting this trade on, you would have more than lost, and then some, during the Great Financial Crisis and COVID recession periods. So, why does this matter other than on a principled level of truth and accountability? Well, a person might decide to de-risk their portfolio of idiosyncratic insurance names to a more diversified approach, basketed approach, via an ETF in order to maintain exposure to a theme that they're bullish on, or due to somebody saying that insurance stocks generally do well better. Now, this is where people, I said earlier, people like to lie and then victim shame others who fall for lies for not doing their own due diligence. Okay, fair enough. You do your own due diligence. But, maybe the person who's saying things should also do their due diligence. Like, they don't get off the hook. Everybody's guilty and complicit and complacent. Here's some further questions. What made him say what he said? Did he go back in time and look at these matters? Was it an intuitive sense he had? Or was he speaking of matters in a confident, absolutist, and generalized fashion which he didn't have evidence for? And if so, what would make a person do such a misguided thing? And then what would make a person communicate that misguided thing to someone else? I've already told you the answer. People's general attitude to disregard and dismiss the truth. And he provided an ostensible macroeconomic answer in a post hoc rationalizing fashion as to why he thought what he did and why he thought that insurance companies do well or better, and then how that correlated to lower beta and volatility. I'm not even sure that that's true. Some of those individual stock price swings were pretty volatile, which then makes the whole basket more volatile. Now, I don't know. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not true, the lower beta, but I don't know. I'm not even confident about that. That's worth looking into, my opinion as well. This was a one-off comment I read about they do well and better, so no big deal, right? Wrong. It's merely an example of a greater pathology plaguing humankind, and more specifically this industry. Recession-proof stocks. If you ask Google what stocks do well or better in a recession, you'll get a bunch of nonsensical garbage like the below. Let me present to you recession-proof stocks, stocks that will outperform or thrive. And Google says, generally, the industry is known to fare better during recessions, or those, not less worse, better. To fare better during recessions are those that supply the population with essentials. We cannot live without that. They include utilities, healthcare, consumer staples, and in some pundits' opinions, maybe even technology. A recession stock is an oxymoron. Practically all stocks go down in a recession. And someone who thinks that their stocks, in all probability, will outperform or thrive in a recession, like many articles noted, is just a moron, or perversely incentivized due to fund mandates. Here's how the SPDR utility, healthcare, and consumer staple ETFs held up, outperformed, and thrived in the last 2 recessions. COVID recession, the XLU did negative 16%, the SPY did negative 9%, the XLP did negative 7%, and the XLV did plus 1%. And then during the Great Financial Crisis, the SPY did the worse, and then the others all did the less worse. So SPY was down 34% coming out of the recession, XLU was down 27%, XLV was down 23%, and then XLP was down 11%. And then .com, so when I said the last 2, I guess I meant the last 3. .com recession, XLU was down 11%. Am I reading the same thing again? The .com recession was, the XLU was down 11%, the SPY was down 7%, the XLV was down 7%, and the XLP was down 0.5%. So, let's see. In the .com recession, everything was negative. In the Great Financial Crisis, everything was negative. And in the COVID recession, only the XLV was actually positive coming out of it. But it was actually, coming out of it, it was still positive by 1%. So that's interesting that, ultimately, using badly or less worse instead of well or better when discussing negative returns is more appropriate due to grammatical correctness, linguistic clarity, semantic implications, and accurate denotation. Speaking this way ensures that the negative nature of the outcome is accurately communicated without implying any positive performance. And that's the problem. Honestly communicating less than ideal information is too much for most. That's how you get thinner as a descriptor. It's the same reason EBITDA is largely reported. Not because it's relevant, but because it's flattering or at least disguises potentially contentious metrics and performance. I broke that down in my article on EBITDA. Just listen to how other people speak. This is what they're saying, okay? Are you ready? This is what people are saying. My negatively performing stock is performing less negatively than another negatively performing stock, so therefore my stock is outperforming, doing better, and or well. That's an absurd way of speaking. It's also an argument of relative privation. It's a diversionary tactic to distract away from the overall absolute performance, which, may I remind you, is negative. Bad people are good people. And now you understand why bad people are good people. By using this same sort of logic that we've discussed here today, it can reasonably be concluded that bad people are now good people because they're less bad than other worse people. They're not less bad people, they're good, better, outperformers. To bring this full circle and sum it up, the same way that all insurance stocks in general do well better in a recession is the same way that bad people are good people. The same garbage-minded, nonsensical framing that we discussed around stocks today just as well applies to people. Bias knows no bounds. And to beat a dead horse here, the media often doesn't say, in general, CPGs do well in a recession. No, instead they say CPGs do well in a recession, meaning that you should be able to buy any CPG and it will do well. Why is it so hard to say in general, in aggregate, CPGs will do less worse in a recession. Why? Why is that so difficult? Because humans are going to human. Along similar lines, for years, I listened to buffoons on multiple cannabis podcasts talk about how stocks were cheap. And when asked how they are cheap, it was often revealed that it was due to them being at a lower multiple relative to other stocks in the sector. Yes, they were sincerely arguing the point that a pile of shit that is less smelly than another pile of shit is valuable due to it being less smelly, i.e. cheap. They were blinded by their bias to such a detrimental extent that they couldn't come to realize that they were ultimately still talking about shit. Those stocks weren't cheaper, they were less expensive or less overpriced. But to these people, less expensive equals cheap. Are you seeing how bastardizing and co-opting language isn't exactly helpful? There you have it. Corrupt, disjointed, incongruent, and compromised speech often leads to false conclusions and faulty expectations, which translates to manifested behavior which causes immense losses for many. The amount of catastrophe that people have brought upon their lives due to their lethargy of speech is indeterminate yet certainly astronomical. I recommend you not be one of them and relinquish yourself of these ill-conceived notions sooner than later. Until next time, thank you for watching.